Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale radio-controlled Armortek Early Production Tiger 1. Since the last video update, a lot of progress has been made to the tank's engine hatch, as well as the other accessories that are found on this section over here. We'll be going over all these modifications and additions in this video. All the components that you see here are the kit supplied parts. Now, I already went over the engine hatch itself, so from there, that takes us now to the engine hatch hinge mechanism. The component is made of all CNC tooling, and this one here is actually a lot more improved compared to the last generation of the Armortek Tiger 1 release. What Armortek went ahead and did was they took their original pattern and they went ahead and added some more features to it, which would have been originally machined into these parts. First, we have the Snorkel cover cap that we have here. Now, this is fully functional, and this hasn't changed compared to the other iterations of the Armortek Tiger 1. In fact, the Armortek kits have had this part functional all the way from day one. Where the piece is different has to do with these two holes that we have here. And the fact that Armortek gave you these components in CNC brass is a very nice addition to be had. Here we have the first smaller version of the cover cap. You'll notice it's made from one piece of CNC brass. It is threaded. And over here you can see the cutouts, which on the real unit would be to unscrew it by hand. The next one is the larger unit. And this one here is going to be located in this section over here. Again, it's basically a scaled up version from the smaller one, and it does have its correct geometry to it. It's a very nice piece indeed. And it's one less piece that I actually have to fabricate for this build. Moving from the filler cap now takes us to the actual hinge itself. The hinge block we have here is staple on these Armortek Tiger 1s, and this pattern here hasn't changed since, I want to say, around the mid-2000s, when they switched over from cast to CNC. The geometry looks pretty good. There will be some slight tweaks made to it, but more information on that is to follow. They are pre-drilled and pre-threaded. You simply just bolt the piece to the engine hatch from the underneath. Other details would include the engine hatch lift hoists. They too are made from CNC aluminum and also have their correct geometry to them. Now, there's also a laser cut steel hook that gets mounted on the inside, which is fully functional, and it's always a nice feature to have on these builds. These come with the Armortek kit, and these I think are going to be used as is, as I don't really see a whole lot of mods that need to be made to this component over here. From the hook now takes us to the tank's Fifl System Y. Now, in a previous video, I talked about the Fifl System canisters themselves, and on this portion here, you can see the remainder of the components. Here we have part of the Y intake. Now, the Y intake is divided into three sections. We have here the center component, and then two of these flattened ductwork, which would then connect to this piece and mount to the rear engine deck as follows. Now, this design is very similar to what was found on the first generation Armortek Tiger 1. The only difference, again, is the material. The old ones were made from a cast white metal alloy, and these ones here are CNC aluminum. From the Fifl System Y takes us to the large air intake that goes on the center of the deck. The component is all machined with not just its pan detailing, but also has the little screw hand knob found on the top. It is solid CNC, and there's no interior detailing on this piece. From there, it takes us to the Fifl System tube retention pieces, which are 2 bars of laser cut steel. And there's also some threaded rods and some fasteners to go along with this. More information on this is to be discussed as the video progresses. Now, the very first bit of equipment that I'm going to be modifying in order to assemble the hatch is going to be the hinge block that we have here. Now, this is the same hinge block that was mentioned before, and it's currently going through its modification process. The first thing that I went ahead and did was, just like with the grill works, like what was described in the last video, I went ahead and played around with the geometry here on the two corners. If you saw that video with the grill work, and also like I showed before when the piece was stock, the piece stock has a nice sharp angle on these two sections over here. On the real Tiger 1, this piece is casted, and the edges tend to be a little bit more softer in comparison to the crisp edges found on the Armortek piece. Now, these here have been adjusted. This was done with the same technique that I showcased in the last video with the use of a file and a little bit of sandpaper. Now, the next bit of modification I'm going to make has to do with these fastener locations that we have here. Now, if you look on the Armortek kit, the pieces are just flush, and the fastener heads will stick above the surface, and this is true for all the Armortek Tiger 1 kits. However, on the real Tiger 1, these fasteners are actually sunk into this piece and leave for a flush surface. Now, to do this procedure, this has to be done on a drill press. You cannot do this procedure freehand, so a drill press is going to be absolutely mandatory and required. The reason for that has to do with, first, you want to have a nice square hole. You don't want it to be canted in any which way, and also you need to have the depth absolutely set. If you are off by a little bit, specifically on these sections over here, you can possibly over drill the material, which will basically ruin the component, because now it's not going to be mounting this piece to the top deck, which, needless to say, is not ideal. Now, on these versions of the Armortek kit, this modification is actually a lot more doable compared to the ones found on the first generation kit. The first generation kit, like I may have mentioned before, this piece here was all casted in a white metal alloy, and because of that, on the underneath here, it wasn't solid, but actually went inward, and all this here was mostly hollow, and these fasteners here were on columns. Now, I have done the same modification to those sets because the columns are thick enough where you could remove the material without it causing any concern for the piece's rigidity. However, it is a little bit more difficult compared to this unit here, which it is solid aluminum alloy plate. And here's the hinge block here, mounted in a vise, and we're sitting here on the drill press. Now, like I said before, the drill press is required for this modification, as well as, equally as important, is a really good drill press vise. You want to keep the piece locked down, nice and flat, and the vise needs to have a little bit of weight to it just so it anchors it down in place. Now, some people out there are going to be wondering, should I fasten it to the table of the drill press? In my opinion, that's not necessary. Just due to the mass alone of the vise, it's more than enough to hold the piece for the type of drilling that I'm going to be doing. Now, the drill press, like I said before, needs to be set with its proper depth, which it is. And I'm just going to go ahead and drill out this row over here. And here you can see the holes now drilled, and they are all at the exact same depth. Now, for the drill bit I have here is a 1/4 of an inch drill bit. This size diameter is perfect for this type of a procedure because with the shape of the fastener, you need the 1/4 inch hole here just to clear the surrounding neck of the bolt. Which for this build is this little guy that we have over here. And you can see how much the piece is more recessed compared to before. I will now do the same procedure to the remainder of the fasteners in the bottom location, and then I'm going to have to readjust the depth of the drill bit for this unit that we have here because it obviously stands above the smaller section, so once you're done with the bottom row, you need to slightly adjust it to get the same type of procedure done on the top section. Now, from the hinge plate takes us to the actual hinges themselves. This hinge that we have here is stock with the Armortek kit, and this one here has been reworked. As you can see, some geometry has been shifted on it in order to better give it that Tiger 1 hinge look and feel. This was just done by hand with a file, and then once it's all reshapen, I'm going to go ahead and mount these to the engine hatch, to which then they'll get some cast texturing and a little bit of sculpted weld beads. While on the engine hatch, this now takes me to the center air intake. Now, like I mentioned before, the air intake is comprised from this unit here, which is all CNC aluminum. It's solid, has no interior detailing whatsoever. Simply bolts to the center of this little crosshair that we have here on the engine hatch. Now, because this tank does have a full interior detailing, I'm not going to be utilizing this part, and the engine hatch itself will be going through some modifications, giving it its interior detailing. In its place, I'll be utilizing this new set that I have here, and I developed. The new set consists of these three components, and gives you better detail accuracy compared to the stock basic piece. You can see here that the unit consists of a bottom base, a mounting lug fastener, and the actual pan itself. Now, unlike the kit version, the pan is completely hollow on the inside and has its correct shape on both the interior and the exterior. If we notice on the stock kit component, the piece has a slab side to it, and it's a straight 90-degree cut line. On the real Tiger one, the piece actually had a slight bevel to it, and when it reached the top, it then angled further in. Now, on the real tank, because the Tiger did have the ability to snorkel, this component here was actually originally designed to be adjustable. When the vehicle would be operating on land, or I should say in battle, the intake would be raised slightly so that it allows airflow to get into the engine compartment. However, when it comes time for actual fording and snorkeling, you would tighten the fastener, and this would seal this lid here to the top to the engine deck, and by doing this creates an airtight seal, preventing water from getting into the engine compartment, thus flooding you out. That's why we have this external knob fastener that we have over here. Now, it's important to point out that when the snorkeling system and feature was dropped on the Tiger ones, which was around, I want to say late 1943 or so, the component was still retained, but the adjustability feature was completely deleted. Those vehicles feature the exact same component, but rather than the knob, there is a cap screw in this location over here, and it's welded solid in place. This design would of course change on the later production units, which utilized the dome pattern of air intake, which was again non-adjustable and was completely solid with the air intake that we have here. Now, for the air intake, you'll notice that it has a series of vents. The early tanks did have 4 vent patterns found on this section, and this was changed on the later production units that only had 3 of these slots. Again, more than likely done to simplify the design. Now, to mount this to the Armortek kit, you do have to do some modification to this section over here. This little crosshair plus cutout is going to be completely deleted, and if we notice on the ECA set, the piece has a certain amount of material that is cut away in this section over here, and this is intended so that this piece can drop directly onto the Armortek piece without any sort of other hand fitting required, and adjustments need to be made to either the piece or the engine hatch itself. Now, before I could go ahead and mount the new dome intake to the engine hatch itself has to go through some modifications. First and foremost, I need to go ahead and add the inner section for the interior detailing. Now, on the Tiger 1, the inside portion of the engine compartment had a small little section that was milled away to create a shelf so that the top engine hatch can lock onto the engine bay of the vehicle. Now, on the Armortek kit, like I said before, the engine hatch is just a single plate of laser cut aluminum, and on the earlier units would have been steel. Now, to mimic that little thickness of that shelf removed, rather than trying to mill into the about 1/8 of an inch thick aluminum plate, I'm going to actually add another panel that's 1/8 of an inch thick over this one, and that's what I have over here. Now, for the plate, I went ahead and utilized a section of Lexan plastic. The reason for the Lexan is just like for the same reasons that I mentioned before, for the use of building materials. It's first and foremost very, very light, and on top of that, it's very easy to work with, more so than the lightness. Lightness is helpful, but for a tank that weighs 350 pounds, it's not really that important. The most important aspect has to do with the ease to work with, and also because it is clear in nature. or it was before I went ahead and polished it up, which I'll go over in a second. The reason why the clear aspect becomes important has to do with lining up the plate to the engine hatch correctly and evenly so that I can mark where the sections that need to be removed have to go. Now, the unit, like I said before, was scuffed up with a palm sander. Now, the reason for this has to do with both the adherence of paint, adhesives, and also for the ability to glue things to this panel. Now, in addition to that, I also went ahead and made a template of this plate over here, and it can be found on the link below to my Facebook page. There you can go ahead and actually download the actual panel and use it as a template for your own build. So if you want to try something like this at home, you have the ability to do so. Now, the unit is going to be mounted to the plate with the use of adhesives, but in addition to the adhesives, you also have some fasteners for the Fifl system intake, as well as also the large air intake for this section over here. These two components are going to aid in keeping this plate firmly in place and prevent it from ever popping off of the main plate. Now, for the main plate revisions, you'll notice that I went ahead and, of course, buffed down the plate with the palm sander, just like I did with the plastic. And the reason for that has to do, again, with the adherence for the glue, but also it helps for paint to adhere to it as well, because I did it to both sides. Now, on the plate itself, first and foremost, you notice that that little crosshair section has been cut away. And the little sections where, the remnants, I should say, where the crosshair was left have been removed with a little bit of some filing. With this now has the hole totally vacant, and the piece can drop directly into location. Now, another modification, notice I went ahead and added countersinks to these sections over here. On the kit, these two sections over here are for the Fifl system tubes, which will be brought across the deck, and these two fastener locations here are for the hinge work, which connects us to the hinge mounting plate. Now, it's important to point out that this panel over here is the underside of the engine hatch. This is the part where the plastic is going to be glued to. The reason why I needed to add these countersinks has to do that on the real vehicle, the fastener locations that are on this kit over here are not present on the real vehicle. So to get the appropriate interior detailing look, you cannot have any visible fastener locations found on the top plate. So I went ahead and added the countersinks so that when I mount this component to the hinge, and also when I add the details for the Fifl tubes, they will be secured to this panel here, nice and firmly, and then once the detail plate gets installed, it conceals all of the fasteners, leaving for a seamless appearance. Now it is at this point here where I can go ahead and add the cutouts to these two locations, and then start with the equipment mounting. Now, it's important to point out that the reason why I utilize Lexan as opposed to other clear materials, namely acrylic, has to do with the fact that acrylic is pure garbage in my opinion. The stuff basically shatters upon looking at it, and trying to add any type of hole or cut, or even just trying to cut it to shape, is almost impossible to do from my experience, and the stuff just shatters upon any sort of tool trying to make some sort of a cut. Now, Lexan is a little bit more on the pricier side compared to acrylic, but you're paying for a better material. Lexan is far superior to acrylic in any way possible, and it's worth every penny. Now, to my European and non-US audience, it may be difficult trying to track Lexan down, because in the United States, apparently the only store to purchase the Lexan material from is the Home Depot, and I'm not sure how it works in other locations overseas, so you might have to do some Googling in order to find this exact same material. The material is Lexan. It is a name brand material, and that's the one that I can't recommend enough for utilizing for not only this application, but if anyone's a fan of my videos, you'll notice I've used this material on many other builds, both static and radio control in the past. Now, before I can go ahead and plate over the engine hatch, the one bit of detailing that I need to do are the Fifl tube mounts. Now, this is one bit of detailing which is specifically found on the early production Tiger, because of course these vehicles had the Fifl air filtration system that was mounted on the rear portion of the vehicle, and of course the tubes run across the top engine hatch. Now, this rendition of the Armortek kit, just like all the other previous renditions, featured a simple laser cut metal strap with the 2 holes cut in that would mount onto and hold the tubes in place via threaded rods and some hex nuts. Now, even though this system is very, very simplistic and does work, on the real vehicle, the mounts were a little bit more elaborate, should I say, which is typical for anything that's designed by the Germans, specifically around this time. Now, on the real vehicle, the strap along the top was not just a simple piece of metal, but actually was a little bit more elaborate. We would have the strap like this, and then there was a small little hollow box which was welded to this section over here. The purpose of this box is this would clamp down on top of the actual tube itself and prevent the tubes from rattling loose while the vehicle was in motion. Now, in addition to this little feature being found on the top, it was also found on the bottom portion as well, and that's exactly what we have here. All the components that you see here on the table are for the bottom portion, or the bottom receptacle, for the tube mounts. Now, for this vehicle, you notice I went ahead and fabricated some pieces in brass and some pieces in plastic. The reason for this has to do with the tank being radio controlled. The part here with the little hollow section needs to be brass because this component needs to be soldered on. The plastic sections are purely for thickness, and once everything gets assembled to the vehicle, this will give the correct thickness and width of the components that are required for the detailing aspect. Now, we notice we have these little blocks over here. These little blocks are going to be positioned on either end, and these actually will hold the threaded rods, which on the real vehicle, of course, would be used to clamp down the top sections of the straps. Now, for the model here, these metal straps are actually going to be sandwiched in between these plastic blocks and these plastic strips. The strips and the blocks are actually threaded so that when the component gets fitted to the vehicle, the fastener, again, gets sandwiched underneath the sheet of Lexan and is actually held in place with the threads found on these locations over here. The purpose of the threads is this keeps the threads locked in place and prevents them from walking loose or falling through, specifically when it comes time for mounting on the top sections. You want to have the threads in a nice secure manner, and the best way to do it is with this method that I have here with the threads. With all the fabrication work now out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and mount all of this equipment to the top portion of the hatch so you see what it looks like once fully assembled. With the plate now added to the lower portion of the hatch, it's now time to start adding on the interior detailing. Now, this was one area that I have been neglecting on releasing any parts for a number of years. However, now I finally got around to doing it. The components that you see on the table are the new addition to the EastCoastArmory.com product line, and these components are the Early Production Tiger 1 engine hatch interior detailing sets. What these do is these give you the detailing for the actual hatch locks that are found on the exterior and the interior detailing. Now, just like all of the rest of the newer items that have been rolling out from ECA lately, these components here are all made from 3D prints. Let's go ahead and take a look at the detailing up close. Starting from the left and working my way right, these two little sets over here are for the exterior detailing, and these two sets here are for the interior detailing. The Tiger 1, specifically on the early production unit, utilized two different type of locks in order to secure the engine hatch to the top deck. The reason for this, again, has to do with snorkeling. Because of the amount of air which is contained inside of the engine compartment, if the tank goes underwater, the water pressure is going to want to force the engine hatch to fly open, which obviously will leave you dead in the water, and it's definitely not something you want to be stuck in. So the Germans went ahead and developed two types of hatch locks. The first main hatch locks are this set here of these four, and then they went ahead and secured it further with these six that we have over here. Now, at this point, I want to point out that once the fording and snorkeling capability was dumped off of the Tiger's design, the Germans changed the design of the locking mechanism, in which the later production units only utilize one hatch set, and this set here is actually also going to be offered on the ECA product line. That version will not have the other components which is needed for the snorkeling version of the Tiger 1. In addition to that, there's also going to be another version of this set which is primarily only going to be offered for the exterior view. The purpose of this is if you have a Tiger 1 and you do not have any interior detailing, the need of the extra components and the cost for which are just not necessary. So for those type of people, we only have this version over here, which will only contain these two sets for an early production tank, and for the later production tank, just the one cookie of parts. Again, all of this information is found on the eastcoastarmory.com catalog. So starting from left to right, first takes us to the first type of lock. Now again, this would be mounted on the exterior portion of the Tiger 1's engine hatch. Now in case if anyone's wondering exactly where do these components go, in the link in the video description I have a link that showcases in great detail the depth and differences between the Tiger 1 engine decks, and there you can see exactly where these components would be fitted. Now if you notice, these locks here are very flush with the engine deck, they're very thin, and you'll notice that in the center there is a square cutout for use of a tool. This would, of course, be used with a wrench, and you would loosen and tighten these components as need be. From there, this now takes us to this type of pattern. Now, this lock here has a completely different tool head, and these locks here are the backup locks that keep the engine hatch secured to the vehicle during forwarding operation. What's interesting to point out is that they utilize two different types of wrenches in order to secure them in place, which probably wasn't a very good idea specifically for maintenance reasons, as now you need two types of tools in order just to get access to the engine compartment, which is probably why this type of pattern wasn't exactly around towards the end of the Tiger 1's life. Now we're done now with the exterior portions. Let's now dive into the interior pieces. Here we have the set here. You can see this set here is very simplistic. It's basically some bars with the latches which would swing out and lock onto the top deck of the vehicle. Very similar to the type of system that you would actually find on a cabinet. So that was probably one of the more simpler design solutions that the Germans incorporated. And then from there now takes us to these main four. Now these main four locks here are the more complex in shape and in design. They are a lot larger compared to the backup units, as one can clearly see, and on the real tanks these would be made from cast metal. We have a large hex bolt which we've mounted in the center portion. And again, these would just pivot out of the way. Now, in addition to the 3D print, we also have two other bit of components. This unit here is a coiled extension spring, and the purpose for this has to do that on the real vehicle, the latch was actually spring retained, and it gave it a little bit of flex in order for the piece to actually slide into the locking position. In addition to that, there's also a strip of styrene plastic stock. This is to be used to cut to lengths which the builder could then mimic the hatch stops which are found on the inside portion of the hatch. Of course, once everything is mounted to the vehicle, you'll see exactly how everything goes. Some other details that I've added to the rear hinge area has to do with this access hatch here, as well as this small little plug. The access hatch and plug are a new upgrade kit found on the eastcoastarmory.com product line, and they are made from 3D printed components. The sets contain both the plug and the hatch, and they are integrally printed to each other. I went ahead and snipped them just for the filming of this take. Normally when they're printed, there's a small little peg back here which the two pieces are connected to. Now when it comes to the hatch itself, the piece has all of its correct geometry to it. Notice this section over here, it's not a straight line. Instead it has a small little hump. This is as per the real unit. And the fasteners that we have are actually small little Allen cap screws, and their detailing is crisply rendered into this component here. Now for the cap, this is to replace the stock Armortek little Phillips brass fitting that I mentioned before. If you notice, rather than the Phillips head, it's a square type wrench, and the piece has a conical shape to it. Again, all of the geometry and shape and detailing is as per the real vehicle. Now this little guy here simply drops directly into place and is a direct replacement for the stock Armortek piece. The access hatch over here gets mounted in this small location. I went ahead and drilled a pilot hole so that the plug can simply just click directly into. with this little component added, this now completes this area here of this component. Now, one thing to point out is that on the Tiger 1, on the engine hinge as well as on the engine hatch itself, these two bits of components underwent the most amount of revisions and changes to the design since the Tiger 1 was first designed all the way up to the end of the production run. So much so that it can get very confusing on which pattern and combo would be best for your build, so you do have to pay attention, specifically if you're really looking to get an accurate version of the Tiger 1. So much so that even many of the plastic model companies tend to screw this up. However, if you keep your eye open, there are certain guidelines to look for. Starting with the basic design itself, on the Tiger 1, this component here was utilized for both to act as a hinge point for the engine hatch, but also had some functions of its own. First and foremost, it would be utilized for the telescoping snorkel tube, which would be screwed into this location here when the cap would be opened. There was also a secondary filler cap that was located here, and this was actually used as another air inlet into the vehicle. There were two other small little axis caps. This one here is rumored to be to refill the oil of the transmission for the fans. And then there was another cap which would have been used to get access to the drainage plug, which is on the bottom of the engine compartment. Another bit of detailing has to do with this hook that we have integrally casted into this piece. This is of course for the hatch retention latch for the engine hatch to clip on, keeping the hatch in the open position during maintenance. Now, originally this would have been located in the middle center of this component right here. Now, moving towards the filler cap, like I said before, was for a secondary air inlet. Now, this bit of detailing and function was deemed completely irrelevant and was dropped very early on in the production run of the Tiger 1. The filler cap that you see integrally molded into most of the models on the market, that on the real vehicle, that would have been welded in place since the feature was dropped and abandoned. Now, vehicles found with that filler tend to be vehicles from the very initial and early production runs, and the reason why they have it is because they had the castings on hand. Once the castings were used up in production vehicles, the next chunks of hinges that came from the foundry had this section completely deleted. Shortly after deletion of this filler cap, the Germans went ahead and developed this large axis hatch that we have here. Now, the purpose of this hatch is up to debate. Some theories are that this hatch was added in order to get better access to the HL210's fan clutch system, which rides directly underneath this section over here. Other theories have to do with the adoption and installation of the HL230. However, with the addition of this hatch, this lug for the hatch retention latch had to have been moved from the center to the side over here, along with the hook itself being moved on the engine hatch. Also deleted was that secondary cap, which I mentioned before, to get access to the drainage plug on the bottom of the vehicle. Now, from the hatch takes us to the filler cap here. This stayed exactly the same from all of the Tiger 1s from the initial all the way up to the final production batches. This, of course, now leads us to the other most constant bit of detailing on this area, and that's the snorkel cover cap. Now, like I said before, the snorkel cover cap was basically there to protect the threads when not in use. You would hinge this open, and this would reveal the threads to screw on the snorkeling system. Now, even though the snorkeling ability was dropped early on in the Tiger 1's production life, this component stayed on this casting throughout the remainder of the war and the Tiger 1's production life. However, towards the mid-production and into the later production units, the piece here was basically nothing more than appendix left over from the earlier iteration of the design and was welded in place, sealing it off just like with the other cap like I mentioned before. Now, on the model that we have here, first you'll notice that the cast texturing has been added, with also the deletion of the stock filler cap detailing that I mentioned before. The filler cap itself was plugged up and the cast texturing was added in place, sealing everything off, leaving for the appearance that we have here. The stock lug was left because this was the appropriate location that this component would have been found on, and I just simply added the cast texturing over it. This, of course, gives me the real estate in order to add the new ECA 3D printed access hatch. Same with the plug. The plug drops directly onto the kit with no mods necessary. Now, from there, this now brings us to the Snorkel cover cap. This unit here, as we notice, is made from cast resin, and I didn't utilize the stock unit. The cast resin one is actually from one of my resin sets for the same type of component, and I modified it and tweaked it to make it fit on the Armortek unit. The reason why I use this as opposed to the metal one has to do with the resin one has the added cast texturing already present in the casting, but also has the interior detailing already hollowed out. Rather than trying to machine this out on the aluminum one, it was just a simple swap out. Now, with the piece hinged open, you can reveal the threads, like I mentioned before, and this unit will be getting its snorkel tube detailing, which would thread into this location over here. This is from the ECA set, and again was just mounted directly to the Armortek unit. Now, moving on from the hinge section, now takes us to the completely redesigned and redetailed engine hatch. Here you can see what the engine hatch is going to look like once the Fifl system intake is bolted on. Currently, it is temporarily not, because after the filming is done, all of this is going to go into primer and painting, and by having the piece off, this allows me to paint everything thoroughly, as obviously trying to get into these areas here is going to be pretty difficult. So that'll be best done once everything is in its coat of base. Starting with the replacement air intake, here you can see how the unit is assembled and fitted to the deck. Now again, just like with the Fifl system intake, this will be mounted permanently once everything is fully painted. But here you can see how the system actually would be very similarly mounted on the real vehicle. This would be in the air intake mode. If you notice, it's not making contact with the deck. And then when the vehicle would go into snorkeling, you would tighten this knob all the way, and now you can see that the intake is now flush against the engine hatch, thus preventing any water from getting into the system. From the intake, brings us to the Fifl system tube mounts. Here you can see how the units get fully assembled and affixed to the top portion of the hatch. And of course, sculpted weld beads are added on all of the appropriate locations. Moving from there now takes us to the engine hatch lifting hooks. The lifting hook sections that you see here are the kit supplied units and were utilized basically as is. However, what was changed was their actual location. If you look on the engine hatch here, you'll see that the stock kit originally wanted you to have these units mounted in these locations, which their original mounting holes have been puttied up and sanded flush with the bodywork. Now, the reason for this has to do with, just like I was alluding to before with the hinge work, the engine hatch went through lots of developmental changes throughout the Tiger 1's run, and this is another one of those types of features. When the vehicle was first developed, there were no hooks design of any sort fixed to the hatch. It was just the basic hatch, and the only thing that would lift it would be sheer brawn by people grabbing onto these lift handles here and just pulling this large heavy hatch upward. Now, this is one of those type of features that are really discovered when the vehicles are put in field and are being used under real actual conditions. Some of the feedback that came back from the crews was that the hatch itself is way too heavy, and opening it up is a physical chore. What the designers went ahead and did was they developed these two retracting hooks that would locate on either side of the engine hatch. They would pivot open, and then you would hook up a cable to it via a winch, and you could then assist in opening up this large heavy hatch. The system was utilized and was put into production. However, there is a bit of a snag. The snag of which being on the tanks that still retain their snorkeling capability, they cannot just put the hooks in these two locations over here. The reason for that is quite simple, is that this is where we have the locking mechanism for locking down the engine hatch for snorkeling usage. So when these units were actually supplied, I believe this was an in-field modification or was done behind the lines, the hooks were actually put underneath these large handles that we have here. Now, this definitely is something that is not very well thought out, because quite obviously you're not going to be able to swing out the retracting hooks with these two handles in the way. It's a very, shall we put, un-German way of a solution. So on some of the vehicles that received this type of modification, the hooks would be in the open position at all times, so it gets getting access to the hoist is much easier. When the Tiger 1 design dropped the snorkeling capability, rather than the units being put in these weird locations over here, they were fitted to the proper location, which would have been directly in behind of the lifting handles. This is where they would stay throughout the duration of the war. However, it is important to point out that if you are working on a North Africa or a early production Tiger, specifically one that has the Fifl system and the snorkeling type detailing that we have here with all these extra locks, you do need to have these sections located underneath the handles, or else it is going to be considered an inaccuracy on your build. Even though it is kind of wacky having the hooks in these locations, but that is neither here or there. Now, the hooks themselves, if you notice, are not currently mounted to the vehicle. These are going to be fixed once everything is fully painted. So you will see them in the next upcoming scenes. From the hooks now takes us to the snorkel locking and engine locking system. Here you can see the main locks with the square head and the snorkeling backup locks with that elaborate castle type setup. These are, again, the new sets from ECA, and they just drop directly onto place. From there, this leads us to the rear lift hook. The rear lift hook, again, was another one of those type of designs that changed and altered throughout the Tiger 1's production life, specifically, like I said before, with the changes that were made to the hinge. Obviously, when the hinge work had its lug in the center location, the hook would have been mounted in this location. Now, some of the problems emerged was when the large hatch was developed, the lug was moved to the corner, and this led to a problem with the retention hook. The problem wasn't with the hook itself, but was with the snorkeling lug. There were a few other remedies to solve this problem, where I believe the second backup lug was located in a slightly different location, but basically the way you see it here was found on several vehicles. Of course, this system here would stay on the Tiger 1 throughout the remainder of its production life. Now, moving our way to the interior portion, here you can see the detailing that has been affixed to this part. Here we have the intake, and you can see that the welds have been completed and sculpted. And here we have both of the lugs for securing the engine hatch to the top portion of the vehicle. Starting with the backup hooks. These were the same ones mentioned before, and here you can see how they affix to the vehicle. Then we have the main latches, which are underneath the circular exterior locks. Now, inside of them, I do have the little spring detailing. It may be difficult to pick up on video, but the detailing is there. In addition to the locks, you can see the stops that are also found on this part. The larger locks did have these overextending locks fitted so that when you're locking the unit in place, you don't over-rotate the piece, and it has a nice portion to tell you when to stop turning. These are fabricated out of strips of styrene stock, which are supplied with the ECA set, and just a little bit of sculpted weld details were added just to complete the look. From here is ready for its coat of primer, weathering, and then, of course, mounting to the vehicle. Now, before I go ahead and get the Fifl intake duct primed and mounted to the engine hatch, one modification I made had to do to the underside. Here you can see I went ahead and milled out a section of the bottom portion. Now, the reason why I did this has to do with detailing. The stock Armortek piece, it's just totally flush and squared off with the aluminum material. Although this is fantastic for exterior detailing, and for most builds out there, the stock version will work perfectly fine. However, because this model here does have the full interior detailing, when it comes time to open up the hatch, you'll notice on this section here there is a slot cut out for the air intake. Well, when the intake is, the stock unit is mounted, you're going to see that it's just basically flat. By milling out this section over here, this gives more added depth to the component, thus making it for a little bit better on the eyes compared to leaving it totally flush. Now again, the only reason why I went ahead and made this modification is because of the interior detailing. If it wasn't for that, the stock unit would have been left basically as is. And just like with the hatches, once the sections were all pre-painted, the dome and the Fifl intake were then mounted to the engine hatch. Here you can see now that everything is one solid color. How much different it looks compared to the stock original offering. Now on the interior portion, the weathering has been added. Now on the intake here, because of the way the set is designed, you only utilize 4 fasteners in order to secure the intake to the top hatch. On the real Tiger 1, 6 fasteners would have been utilized, and 6 holes are present on the original tooling from Armortek. Now again, if the model was being built as an exterior model only, the extra fasteners are necessary and aren't needed. However, again, because of the interior detailing, the 3 fasteners that we have here are the ones that actually hold up the intake to the engine hatch, while these 2 ones here are actually just dummies and are there just to complete the look. Also, once complete, you can see how the added depth of the milling from the intake that I did before really comes into effect. Only thing that remains now is to get this guy bolted to the rear deck area. Okay, now here's the rear hatch assembly now affixed to the rear deck. The bolts that were utilized were the kit supplied ones, which, if we recall from the last video, are the accurate ones for a Tiger 1 because they have their square heads on them, as opposed to just being your traditional Allen or hex bolt type setup. They were assembled totally out of box with no mods needed, and went on perfectly fine. The piece is fully functional, and you can see with the way the kit, or the way I redesigned the hatch to have the correct pattern of inlet, even with the interior detailing, the hatch still closes onto the rear deck in a nice flush manner, again as per the real unit. Now on the inside portion, here you can see all the fasteners that were used for all of the grill work assembly. Now one thing I did since the last video was that I went ahead and trimmed all of the descending threaded sections from all the bolts. All the bolts were mounted on, again, with red Loctite, so they're not going to go anywhere. The reason why I wanted to shorten them is just that with the way they descend from the lower section, this could cause issue with, one, snagging of anything, specifically if you need to take off the rear deck. But also, because of the interior detailing, with the low profile of the fasteners, this should eliminate any need for them making contact with anything on the inside. And furthermore, it also makes alignment of the rear deck onto the tank, it makes things a little bit more streamlined and a little bit easier to do. All that remains now is to get this guy mounted onto the rear deck. Now, if you see here, by the way, you'll notice I went ahead and fastened some of the tow cable mounts. More information on this is to come in the next video update, because this video has already gone long enough, and the other video should be uploaded in a fairly quick manner. And here we have the rear engine deck panel now remounted to the tank's upper hull. Now to open the engine hatch, I just grab on the handle and of course just lift up. And this reveals both the interior detailing of the engine hatch, which of course has been the focus of this video, and of course the engine interior, which has been discussed in much detail in earlier project update videos. And of course, to seal it up, the engine hatch just gets lowered back into place. With the engine hatch now closed, this brings us back to the snorkel cover cap. Now, like I said before, this vehicle would have had the snorkeling capability present in this particular rendition of the Tiger 1. And to finish off the detailing, I actually fabricated the snorkel that I have here. Now, the set here is a common item found on the eastcoastarmory.com product line, and it consists of a kit where you get several lengths of pre-cut PVC tubes, as well as resin end connectors with both male and female ends, so you can thread the unit together in much the same ways it's done on the real vehicle. To mount on the detailing, you swing open the cover cap, then you go ahead and just thread the unit together. The Snorkel is comprised of 3 sections, of course one larger than the other, and then the unit just threads directly into place. And voila, your vehicle now has its snorkel fitted. With the camera pulled back, here you can see how tall the snorkel unit is once mounted to the vehicle. Now, of course, the model itself cannot actually snorkel. This is just for detail purposes only. But if you have an early production Tiger and you really want to give it that little next kick with the detailing, the snorkel set is a very easy way to do it. With the detailing of the engine hatch now out of the way, the next area to focus on will be the installation and mounting of the Fifl air filtration canisters. However, more information on this, of course, is to come in a follow-up project update video. And with that, that wraps up this project update video for this 1/6 scale Armortek Early Production German Tiger 1. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to the ECA channel, where you can keep in the loop of new project update videos for this build when they get posted, as well as model showcase video for the other builds that get posted on this channel as well. In addition to subscribing, don't forget to swing by the EastCoastArmory.com Facebook page, where there are more photographs of this particular build that have been posted since the project start, along with the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been built through the years. Finally, don't forget to swing by EastCoastArmory.com, where there are more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks for watching.